Namaste and welcome to the Som Yoga and Ayurveda podcast.
A space to dive into how we as humans can live more intentional, ethical, and sustainable lives.
And how we can come into harmony with ourselves, others, and nature in the process.
We share tips to help you cultivate a healthy body, calm mind, and a strong purpose through traditional Vedic wisdom of yoga and Ayurveda.
My name is Aaron Petty. I'm a yoga teacher trainer, and yoga therapist, but above all, a student of this great tradition.
And my name is Paige Taylor. I'm a yoga teacher, Ayurvedic health consultant, advocate for sustainable living, and lover of all beings.
And on today's episode, we're going to be talking about a topic that could potentially be a little awkward for some listeners.
Yeah, I guess so. I guess it's a little taboo still.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah, we're going to talk about menstruation and more specifically, we're going to talk about the Ayurvedic perspective on menstruation, which is really exciting. And it's something we've been talking about for a long time, about recording. And I actually just ran a workshop over the weekend that was about 3 hours long on this concept. So trying to condense it is going to be a fun and interesting task. But I guess I want to provide everyone listening a really nice, well-rounded introduction into how we can, use our menstruation as this beautiful tool, a beautiful sharer of wisdom that we can use in such magnificent ways to align ourselves with, to live a life of an alignment with our cycle and, use it to our advantage and create routines and rituals at different parts of our cycle so that we really harness the power and the vulnerability and the emotion that comes with our menstrual cycle as women.
Yeah, and I think that this is a conversation that we're engaging in quite often with our teacher trainees. And every time this conversation comes up on our 200-hour training or whatever training it is that we're running, you kind of see the light bulbs go off.
Yeah,
Those
totally.
like aha moments of like, wow, I can't believe that that's the way things are. And so I think for me as a man, it was never a conversation that I was ever involved in until I started teaching yoga, and particularly I started teaching yoga to women. And even then, it was only until I met Paige that I really started to unpack this for myself and understand how it affected me as the partner of a woman.
Yeah.
And I think just like on that culturally, in the societal setting, the social setting, this is not a topic that's often discussed. I think for me as a child, I always knew that women menstruated, but I didn't know what it was. All I knew was that they would bleed. I didn't know why. And on top of that, like my conversations about this with my mother, with my sister, were always kind of like,
Hush, hush.
it's women's business. It's women's business, and we don't talk about that.
And what a disservice, honestly.
Yeah, totally.
And I think that when we started dating, you had listened to a podcast.
I was recommended a podcast by a teacher of mine to deal with you in a more not to deal with you, but to integrate with you in a more holistic way.
Yeah, totally.
And to help me to understand why at certain times of the month we couldn't do the same practice.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting. And I think you're 100% right. This is not just a conversation for women. And it can be so incredibly empowering and supportive for men to listen to it as well.
Well, I think it's integral knowledge for all men.
100%.
I think any man that lives with women should have at least a superficial understanding of the process and the cycle that a woman goes through month to month. And I think maybe our first point could be that conversation around that men and women live on different rhythms. They live on different cycles. And when we say cycle, you can think of it like the cycle of day and night, or the cycle of a year, or the cycle of the seasons, that everything in nature works in a cyclical way. You know, it's dawn, and then it's daytime, and then it's dusk, and then it's nighttime. And that cycle is continuing.
Yeah.
Daytime, nighttime, daytime, nighttime. And at various times during that cycle, nature is aligning in specific ways. And in yoga and in Ayurveda, that's kind of the worldview that we take, is that we want to understand and tap into those cyclical rhythms of nature and align ourselves with those cyclical rhythms of nature. And so when we talk about the rhythms, the cyclical rhythms of a man and a woman, we're talking about biological hormonal rhythms. What are hormones? I'm asking you, Paige. What
I
do you
don't
think a
really know
hormone
if
is?
I could answer that question. They're like,
Okay, hormones are chemical compounds.
yeah,
They're chemical compounds that are excreted through throughout our body through all of these different glands, which we call our endocrine system. We know that there's all these different systems in our body. We have the respiratory system and the vascular system and the cardio system, the breathing and the blood and the digestive system that digests. And this endocrine system is just another one of these systems. Therefore, it has a bunch of different places in the body where it lives. And these places that give life to the endocrine system are called glands. And there's all sorts of glands in your body. And if you're in the yoga community, if you're in the spiritual community, you've probably heard about the pineal gland. Is a hot topic.
and the pituitary gland.
Pituitary gland. We've got the thymus gland and the adrenal glands in the kidneys. And then we've got our reproductive organs as well. They also are glands. And so what these glands do, you can think of them as like an excretory system where we have these glands, and within these glands, specific hormones are produced. And these hormones are like a chemical compound that interacts with our body in different ways. And so these hormones will all do different things. We all know about the hormone adrenaline. What does adrenaline do? It raises our heart rate. It brings on this stress response and allows us to interact with dangerous or stressful things in a more efficient way. We know about the melatonin hormone, which is the hormone that puts us to sleep. And so this process is always going on in all people at all times. And this conversation specifically is about the difference between the hormonal cycles of men and women, because they are different cycles. So maybe we can talk about those two rhythms.
Go for it.
The rhythm that most of us know about is called the
Circadian rhythm.
Circadian rhythm. And the circadian rhythm is a day-to-day rhythm. And it's present in both men and women, but men kind of default to a circadian rhythm. And in women, they have a complementary rhythm called an infradian rhythm. And we'll start with the circadian rhythm. Basically, at about 5 o'clock in the morning, you get a rush of certain hormones and you wake up. Your body starts to wake up and it's time for you to get up and out of bed. And in that morning period, things need to start moving. And so everything gets moving as we progress throughout the day, all the way to about 2 o'clock. We're getting hormones that are telling us that it's time to do. It's time to work. It's time to exert ourselves.
And if you want to hear about this from the Ayurvedic perspective, I think we've got a podcast on the daily routines.
Yeah, I think we've got
Somewhere.
the dosha cycles.
Yeah, maybe
somewhere
we
in
could
there.
link that.
And so, yeah, we're talking about this from a hormonal level. We'll talk about it from an Ayurvedic perspective in a little while. About 4 o'clock, what happens is there's another shift in these chemicals and you start to get a little tired, a little more drowsy. And for most of us, that 4-5 o'clock mark is the end of our workday, and then we're winding down until about 8 o'clock, 9 o'clock, where the melatonin levels rise and we start to feel a little bit sleepy, and then we go to sleep. And so most people run on that cycle. There can be, certain imbalances in the endocrine system that will disrupt that cycle. But that's the natural cycle, that we should be rising just before the sunrise, and then we should be laying to rest after the sun sets. And that's kind of the evolutionary body clock that all of us have intrinsically.
Yeah.
And so the idea here is that men run on that cycle, and that's, in a way, that's why the world is built around that cycle. That's why we start work at 9 o'clock and we finish work at 4 or 5 o'clock. It's so that we can maximize that productivity within that hormonal cycle. Now, the interesting thing is that that is the male endocrine cycle, but the female endocrine cycle is a little bit different. It's called the infradian rhythm. And that cycle takes this daily cycle of high energy in the middle of the day, low energy in the evening time, and it spreads it out over a month. So that women have a midday for 1 week of the month, and they have a midnight for 1 week of the month, and then they have the movement toward and the movement away from in those other 2 weeks of the month.
Yeah.
I would assume that most women would resonate with that. For me as a man, it was one of those things where I was like, holy shit, that is such a shift in perspective. Because if you don't understand that, you just expect women to be feeling exactly the same as men do all the time.
Which is like you roughly feel the same at 8 a.m. every day of the week, and you roughly feel the same at 4 p.m. every day of the week.
Yeah. And like for me as a man that's relatively balanced and that I've got, a healthy system, like all of my bodily systems are healthy, I wake up at 5 o'clock every morning on the dot. There's no change in that. And when I get up at 5 o'clock, all I want to do is start moving and lifting weights and doing things that are hard. And that energy will sustain until about 2 o'clock, 3 o'clock, 4 o'clock if I'm lucky. And then I just have this crash where all of my energy feels like it's completely zapped from me, and I just want to rest.
Yeah, very interesting.
And it's just a day in, day out. And that's not the case for all men, because there can be all sorts of hormonal imbalances.
Totally.
But for like healthy men, that's a pretty regular cycle.
Yeah, and I think just on top of that you can look at it that men's hormones will peak in their like late 20s as well, and then gradually begin to decline over time, but like relatively stable day to day.
Yeah.
And so that even you could compare it that that peak and fall that a man experiences over the entire course of his life is what a woman experiences in a month.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah.
And so like your early to mid 30s is like peak ovulation for men.
Yeah,
It's
totally.
like the most fertile time.
Yeah, 100%.
Whereas women have early to mid 30s
Once a month.
1 week a month.
Yeah.
From the age of 13 to 50.
Yeah, it's very interesting, that's for sure.
How interesting.
Cool. I think that's a good place to start. And I think it's powerful to understand what the difference is between men and women in terms of like endocrine system and hormones. And I think that, it's important to make that distinction, and that we know that, we can use this to our advantage. It's not men are so lucky to have that stable cycle and women are so unlucky. That's definitely not the case. We just need to understand how to utilize and harness that potential power to the best of our ability.
Totally. And I think that once you understand a woman's cycle, and that you start to look around at the world, you realize that the world's not really set up for women to thrive.
Yeah, I think this is
especially
a good place to start.
in this working environment. And we've been really lucky because we work for ourselves. And I've been working for myself for 6 years now.
Yeah.
I haven't had a job for 6 years. And Paige, for the last 3 years maybe, has been working with me full time. And so we've been really lucky that we stumbled across this information, and because we had so much freedom within our business structure, we can set up our days differently.
Yeah, totally.
We can set up our months differently. And with this information in mind, we can plan out our months in relation to Paige's cycle. And we can kind of like maximize her productivity in the time when we know that she'll have the capacity to be productive.
Yeah.
And we can take all of her workload off of her when she doesn't have the capacity to be as productive as she could be.
Totally. Yeah, powerful.
And I think that that it's a shift that we need in society, that we cannot biologically expect women to be performing in a productive way all the time, as far as like doing, like, just from the perspective of just like pure
Work
output
culture, yeah.
where it's like, it doesn't mean that taking time to menstruate is unproductive. It's more so that, like, from the perspective of business and work and capitalism, that there's a time for doing, and then there's a time for being as well.
Yeah, totally. I think that this is a good place to start, and I prefaced my workshop with a bit of history and context, and I think that's a great place for us to start now as well.
Cool.
That you know, back in the day, archaeological findings share with us that many, many moons ago, the woman was worshipped. And as you know, a very much goddess-like figure. And, you know, there's stone carvings, there's wood carvings that depict this, you know, worshipping of the feminine form.
Even in the tradition that we study.
Totally.
Like the tradition of Tantra, what separates Tantra from yoga is the worship of the feminine.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's a beautiful concept, really.
Yeah, totally.
But something along the lines has misconstrued, and, you know, that these societies and culture where women were worshipped, you know, were really, I guess, invaded and destroyed in the most simplest way possible. That you know, these military groups and this patriarchal society kind of formed. And even if you think all the way back to like the beginning of religion and Christianity, and the you know, God construct was that God is a male, and then that was then, I guess, you know, embodied to most people in the Western world, and that, you know, women were not a man, and therefore women were not God. And so there became this almost shame around just being a woman. And I guess then what, you know, differentiates a man from a woman is that a woman menstruates and a woman has the ability to have child. And then, you know, thus just through you know, relativity, the shame of just being a woman became the shame of being a woman who menstruates, the shame of a woman who gives birth, that has, you know, has all this incredible power, but woman is not God, so woman is shamed.
I think that shame thing is an interesting one, because that has been my experience from the outside, is that like menstruation was always shameful.
Yeah, totally.
You know, it was always embarrassing.
Yeah.
It was always hidden because it was considered shameful.
Yeah, and we were talking about this in my workshop the other day, and it came up, this concept, I guess. And one of our girls, one of the students that was present, was talking about how that, you know, it's not even that, you know, menstruation is shameful and that there needs to be a sanitary bin, you know, in the toilets for you to put your products. Like, can't just go in the normal bin, which could be because of contamination in blood, you know, whatever, which is fine. But that there has to be a specific sanitary bin in every cubicle. That, like, even among women, you know, you don't want other women to know that you're menstruating. Yeah. Interesting, huh?
Very interesting.
It was an interesting point that she brought up, and very relevant. And so I guess from that perspective of shame, and that's kind of where woman was held in for a long period of time, and the patriarchal society ruled is ruling still, but it's been a long time, and slowly the paradigm is shifting. But I think I was listening to something the other day that was like the gender equality pay gap, and that, Australia ranks 43rd in the world for like even just gender equality pay gap. But that's not what we're talking about here. So
Definitely not in this business.
we won't get into that. But then I guess in the terms of history was the Industrial Revolution really was what took hold, and that in that state women were really divided into two different societal classes: the weak little woman that couldn't do anything, or a strong like uncomplaining breeder worker woman.
Interesting. And so that what you're saying is like the housewife and the working woman.
Yeah, totally.
That's very interesting.
Yeah, and so obviously for the worker woman, menstruation became a nuisance because it cut down her time of being productive in terms of output, like we were just saying, and that if she was earning, valuable income for a family by hour or by piece that she was making or creating, then resting on her period was just a luxury that was unaffordable to that woman.
And so from that perspective, that's kind of where the plug it up and put it away
100%
kind of mentalities come from.
Yeah, and there's these wordings that I found on the topic is like the technology of suppression.
That's interesting because, what we're seeing right now culturally is this kind of like girl boss movement.
Totally.
Like women can do just as much as men can do, this kind of like feminism movement, which in some cases is pushed to the extreme of like women should be in power.
Yeah.
But it doesn't really solve this issue, does it?
No, it doesn't.
It's really just like trying to make women something that they're not without honoring what is innate to them.
And I guess the other side of this coin is that the other woman was, a weak middle-class woman that, were portrayed as if they needed protection from the outside world and, blah, blah, blah. And I guess that, were always, needed to be careful because they might get sick or weak or whatever. And so there's really these two sides is that, we don't need to see menstruation as an illness. That's not helping anyone. But what's also not helping is ignoring it and pretending that it doesn't exist.
Yeah, I think there just needs to be a certain respect around menstruation.
Yeah, 100%. And, that especially when we talk about like women and the feminist movement is that, well, in the back in the day that women were deemed unreliable because of the changes in their hormones throughout the month. And that's the reason that they were kept from positions of power because of, like unreliability.
That is interesting. And especially like if you think about positions of leadership that like, because of that hormonal cycle, there can be differences in emotions. There can be like differences in sensitivity.
Yes.
And if the society needs a stable, level-headed leader that can make decisions in times of war, perhaps that makes sense. I
mean, it makes sense, sure, but there's so many different constructs that you could move forward with that is totally different.
That there could be like, and it's like potentially in a post-war era, there's space for that.
Yeah, and I think it's also important to consider that like, even if there's unreliability in the hormones, it doesn't mean that they're not able to lead.
Yeah.
And that, a time of menstruation or inwardness is a time where somebody is more sensitive and more tapped into the creative potentials and has the ability to, lead in a vulnerable way. It's just different is all. And people don't like different.
Yeah. But in a time where there's like wars and bombs and just like that there is so much suffering and conflict, I can see how the society at large wasn't ready for that idea.
Yeah, totally.
You know what I mean?
I get it.
There was an almost a sternness to the collective consciousness. And I'm not saying that it's right or wrong. I'm just saying I can see how that was portrayed.
I can see that too, but I think that what got lost was how women can support. Anyway, I think we're getting off the topic.
We love a tangent though.
But I think that, women and men need to be honored and acknowledged as different and the strengths of each empowered. And
Paige, you could get cancelled for saying that.
But I guess it's true. That,
totally. And like from that just strictly biological perspective, I think there needs to be that distinction between woman and man and what each is capable of and potentially can be celebrated for.
Totally, 100%.
Like they're both strengths.
Yeah. And I think as we move into a, post two gender society, that, there's strengths to all genders, and we'll begin to understand hormonal influences a little bit better as we move forward in life with like transgender people and that of the likes, that it's just there's differences in us all, and that we can be celebrated, but we no matter who we are, no matter what we identify as, like there needs to be a harnessing of the power and a deep understanding of our physiological body, and what's going on in each moment, and the hormones, and using that to our advantage for sure. Cool.
Okay.
So I guess after that, women's spirituality movement kind of increased in the late, 80s, 90s, where menstruation was begun to be seen as something sacred and meaningful once again. And that, I guess this posed a threat almost to the worker woman, that the listening or tapping into the wisdom of menstruation could affect her ability to be just as good as a man, and sometimes better. And of course that feels scary. Change is always scary. So, I guess through all this history, that's what we mentioned, that the technology of suppression was created to create this myth of the superwoman, that, someone who is bleeding is actually no different to somebody that is not. And that's just simply not true.
Yeah. I would like to just maybe take a little side step and just look at how does this affect yoga practice? How has this come to fruition in the yoga world? Because that's kind of the landscape that we're working in.
Okay, yeah, cool.
I think that like the one thing that we see is this practice, modern practice that's quite intense. That there's a lot of pumping, there's a lot of upside down, there's a lot of intensity, hot rooms, sweating, all of this kind of stuff we see in yoga, and that is certainly appropriate for men all the time, but it's not appropriate for women all the time. And on top of that, because our modern yoga practice, and maybe we'll do a yoga history conversation one day, but because our modern yoga practice was initially designed for teenage boys in particular to curve their hormones, there's almost this belief that's been inserted. Paige, you mentioned like the superwoman archetype, that a woman can do the same practice every week of every day of her cycle. And we see this in the modern context a lot, that women will come to a practice that's entirely inappropriate for menstruation, and then maybe you're lucky enough to have a teacher that's aware of this and says to the class, this asana is not appropriate for menstruation. But then the menstruating woman will take the asana. I think you have a story about this, where you came into headstand because you didn't want anyone to know you were menstruating.
Yeah, not me personally, but I can imagine that of the likes.
Yeah, maybe it was someone else that told me that story.
Yeah, just like I know this story, like that as an amateur yoga practitioner, when I was a baby practitioner, that, a man was teaching my class, and a beautiful man, not you, but somebody else, that mentioned like, don't do this if you're menstruating. And it's just like, back in the day, I was like, what do you know? Like, first of all,
who are you to tell me what I can't do while I'm menstruating?
Totally.
I'm a superwoman.
But with no like context or I guess idea around it, why would I, not take an option in a class that everyone else is taking to make me stand out as somebody that is menstruating, and also look weak almost because I can't take an option? It's just such an interesting thing that goes through the mind, or my mind, at that point of time. And the truth of it is that, it's because of so many different reasons, but very specifically, like energetically and physiologically, there are certain things that we want to avoid in asana practice when we're menstruating to, keep the flow balanced, not only the flow of blood, but the flow of hormones and the flow of prana, of energy, to make sure that we don't cause any symptoms. Because the truth of like, PMS, and which is premenstrual syndrome is what it's called, but I like to say premenstrual symptoms. That it's it's all caused by certain things that we're doing. It's all caused by imbalance. And so many things can be caused by like what we're actually doing when we're menstruating and not, encouraging or allowing that flow of energy down and out, which is the energy of menstruation.
And what do we call that in Sanskrit?
Apana Vayu.
Apana Vayu.
One of the winds of prana.
So if you listen to our podcast called The Nature of Prana, if you haven't listened, maybe you can go back and listen to it. But you will know of the Pancha Prana Vayu, the 5 movements or the 5 winds of prana. Inwards, assimilative, expansive, upwards, and down and out. The Apana Vayu is the excretory function, that releasing of that which we do not need.
Yeah.
And this is menstruation.
Yeah. And so obviously there's certain things in yoga, asana, that, don't support that, specifically inversions,
Back bends.
certain back bends for sure, anything where the hips, I guess, are elevated in a certain way. And also, techniques like Kapalabhati, where you're pumping the abdomen, and Uddiyana Bandha, where you're drawing everything up. Even Mula Bandha to an extent is like almost plugging the flow of apana from moving down and out.
Yeah. And you can really get a tangible sense for that when you're doing a practice, that a lot of the practices that we do are designed to move prana upwards, up the spine toward the higher chakras. And menstruation is the exact opposite.
Totally.
And so it can be more of an intuitive thing, that it's those poses where your hips are elevated above your heart or above your head. It's the hard, difficult back bending postures. It's the inversions, and it's anything that's intense.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that's just important to understand and notice. And it's not like, oh my God, you can't do that on your period, because it's always going to be your choice, and it's always going to be how you feel.
You could do it.
Totally. It's just about understanding the effects and how you feel after certain things like that. And if you even just, think about menstruation as, bleeding out from the vagina down and out, flipping that on its head and allowing the blood to trickle back into the body in some ways, really the basis of like what endometriosis is the endometrium lining, spawning in parts that it's not meant to. And so, you start to connect dots like that, and not to say that endometriosis is caused by doing headstands on your menstrual period, but, there's correlations and there's understandings of how energy moves. And it's powerful to know that. Yeah, I think I covered all that we need to say about yoga for now. Yeah, okay. And so, even on this topic even further, like we mentioned, this technology of suppression, that, we have all these tools so that nobody knows that we're menstruating. Specifically, in gym culture and exercise culture and work culture, especially women, we wear these little yoga pants, with very thin material, and I guess, these kind of things of blood and even like menstrual pads could be quite obvious in that. And so I guess the technology of suppression that we're very familiar with is that of, tampons, which are these little cotton things that you plug up your vagina to catch the blood, if you don't know what a tampon is, but maybe you don't.
And in both yoga and Ayurveda, like, there is a very strict rule that you should never suppress any natural urges.
Yeah.
Burping, farting, coughing, menstruating, none of this should be stopped. It should all be let out in the way that the body needs to let it out.
Yeah. And so I guess, that kind of speaks to the idea of tampons and even menstrual cups, something that we've seen arise in the last few years. A menstrual cup is just something made out of silicone most of the time that is, again, plugged up into the vagina to catch the blood before it falls out. These ideas that, we should be hiding our menstrual blood or suppressing it is just not super helpful. And that, this idea of a panavayu, of down and out, the tampons and the menstrual cups don't support that flow at all. It is, to some extent, stopping the flow of prana from moving out. And that's why it's most revered in the perspective that I'm sharing, that, we're allowing the blood to flowly free from the body, and that we can use, different pads. We can use pads to support that. There's so many beautiful ones that you can get that are actually organic cotton and reusable. so that you wash them after you bleed. We've also got menstrual underwear, and then we also have conventional pads, which I guess are disposable ones. They're pretty common. And then on top of that, there's this concept of free bleeding, that you don't actually use anything to catch the blood.
Interesting.
Yeah. And we were talking about it in my workshop the other day as well, because one of the beautiful women does that. And that, you know, she was explaining that once you become so in tune with your body, you know when the blood is about to leave the body, like you can feel that. And I definitely resonate with that for sure. I always wake up, as you know, if I'm getting my period when I'm asleep, I always wake up, or I'm always aware of the moment that it starts, like, you know, before it starts, hopefully. And she was explaining that, you know, she's so attuned to her body in that way that she, you know, just goes to sit on the toilet or goes to sit on the ground in her backyard or something like that at that moment, to, you know, allow the blood to freely flow and move into another realm.
Interesting.
Yeah, it is interesting. And that of, you know, organic reusable pads and that of organic menstrual underwear is a bit different, because we're so used to this idea of disposing of the blood and, you know, nobody needing to see the blood. And even as a young girl, you're taught, like, if you're taking your tampon or your pad out, you like wrap it in toilet paper first and then you put it in the bin, so that nobody sees or whatever it is. And it's just so interesting that that's the case. And yeah, I guess with these new methods of conscious menstruating and menstruating in alignment with cycle, that if you are using something like a pad reusable or underwear reusable, that you need to interface with that exchange of blood in every month, and that, you know, you have to rinse them, you have to wash them, and you see the blood. It's just a very interesting thing to come to terms with and be accepting of.
Totally. So why don't we have a look at, like, what are the phases of this infradium cycle, and what do they look like? Yeah,
I think that's a great topic. I don't think we need to spend too long in each cycle, because it's just going to be a quick overview. But basically, we can view the menstrual cycle as the seasons of the seasons of the climate, kind of like Aaron referred to. Everything is cyclical, and a cycle that we're all very used to and very acquainted with is the cycle of the seasons of summer, of winter, of autumn, of spring. And that, you know, we can reflect our menstrual cycle within this construct, and that's supportive for us to understand.
Quick question.
Yeah.
Would this be considered Ritucharya in Ayurveda, that you would change your Dinacharya based on this cycle?
Totally.
Cool.
Totally. And that there's so many different things, and we'll talk about it a little bit as we go through, from the Ayurvedic perspective, of things that we can do to support ourselves during this cycle. But basically, I'm not going to give you an overview of Ayurveda and the doshas. I am kind of expecting you already have some foundational knowledge. If you don't, we have so many podcasts on that.
So many.
But basically, we have the 3 doshas that we'll be talking about. We're talking about Vata dosha, which is comprised mainly of air and ether. We're talking about Pitta dosha, which is mainly comprised of fire and water. And then we're talking about Kapha dosha, which is mainly comprised of earth and water. And so these 3 doshas rule everything in Ayurveda. They rule nature, they rule our bodies, and in turn they rule our cycle. However, the menstrual cycle from a very Western perspective is that of 4 stages. So of course there's some, you know, difference, overlap between this when we're looking at it from the Ayurvedic perspective. And it's also important to understand the nature of transition, that even in our seasons there is transition. It's not on the 1st of March or on the autumn equinox, you know, it becomes autumn.
It's a slow gradual progression.
It's a slow gradual process, and, you know, we're in the transition from summer to autumn right now, and, you know, there's a few days that feel like autumn, and then there's a few days that feel like summer, and
we noticed the leaves start falling weeks before we had the official transition to autumn, where it's autumn. Today's the first day of autumn. But I was already raking leaves.
But yeah, so it's just important and powerful to understand that power of transition, that even when we look at it through the lens of this menstrual cycle wisdom, that there's still moments of transition and there's still moments of differentiation between woman to woman, and it will just depend.
And that cycle between women is not always the same.
Oh yeah.
What's the spectrum on days? It's like
28 days is the average, which is the cycle of moon. It could be like 21 days is a pretty short cycle. Even shorter than that could be, 30 plus days as a long cycle.
Yeah.
And then on top of that, you have people that have an irregular menstrual cycle where it could be completely irregular, like once every 3 months. You have people with amenorrhea that don't actually menstruate at all due to some hormonal imbalance in their bodies.
Yeah.
And then you have women going through menopause, where it does very much vary. And sometimes it can be months and months without a period.
Okay.
So yeah, the cycle is the spectrum is so
and I
raging.
think it's just such an important point, because we have to understand that not everyone's the same, that cycle could be so variant person to person.
Totally. And I think I'll preface this conversation by saying that what we'll talk about is roughly, like a 28-day cycle, the cycle of a month.
And we have to speak in averages because we need some kind of common language.
Yeah. And that, if you're not somebody that has an average cycle like that, maybe it's a little longer, maybe it's a little shorter, this knowledge is still very adaptable to you, and that you will be able to start to apply this wisdom to your cycle and really start to fine tune how you feel on certain days to know where you lay within this cycle. And then on top of that, women who are menopausal or postmenopausal, that there's the beauty of this, that, you can, if you're perimenopausal and you're in that transition, you can definitely use this with your menstrual cycle. But the wisdom of it being in alignment with the moon cycle as well is so rich. And it's often recommended that if you don't have a menstrual cycle anymore, to go off, via hysterectomy or amenorrhea or menopause, where you don't actually have the cycle anymore, that you do the same rhythm but to that of the moon, is that you don't let your menstrual cycle guide you. You allow the menstrual cycle of, the moon, of the woman.
Yeah, because that cycle is already inherent within
100%.
nature. And we're trying to align ourselves with the cycle of nature.
Yeah, definitely.
So those feminine qualities exist within that.
Yeah. So yeah, let's talk about that. So basically there's a few different concepts that we can talk about when we're talking about the cycle of menstrual cycle. Some people say that the first day of your bleed is the first day of your menstrual cycle, but I like to say the first day after you finish bleeding is the first day of your menstrual cycle, because it represents the bleed is the end of the cycle for me, and then the first day after bleed is the first day of your cycle. That's just what resonates for me and what makes sense for me.
Great.
Cool. So
can I just pause? Could we maybe just, with each stage of this cycle, maybe you could recommend some yoga and Ayurvedic practices that we could incorporate during these stages? And on top of that, I think it's really interesting to just think about a lunar cycle and a solar cycle, that circadian rhythm is the solar cycle, the sun cycle, the day cycle, and the moon cycle, the infradian rhythm, is the month cycle. Where we can really look at this in nature of, like, the sun rises and sets at the same time every day, but the moon is full and empty at different times of the month.
Big yawn. Cool. Well, let's get into it. The first stage of our menstrual cycle. So this is from the day that you stop bleeding, roughly for about a week, I guess we could say, maybe longer. What we call in Western word is follicular phase. And this is oftenly referred to as our springtime. So like the essence of spring, of, sowing the seeds and everything starting to come back to life. You start to get your energy back after your menstrual period. It's that phase of almost rebirth. And in relation to the moon, it's the waxing moon. So it's when the moon is no longer new anymore and it starts to grow bigger and bigger and bigger with every day.
Cool. And so those, it's the follicular phase, but what are the follicles?
Yeah. So I guess from the anatomical perspective, during this cycle, the pituitary gland stimulates or releases, the follicular stimulating hormone. Have a bit of dyslexia, I think.
Abbreviated to the FSH.
Yeah, so that's often abbreviated to FSH hormone, obviously, and the release of this is most likely happening even when we're still menstruating. And so that's that beauty of transition. And so what happens is this hormone starts to signal for 6 to 8 roughly follicles to start developing. And all of those follicles within the anatomy, the woman's body, contain an immature egg. And so a bit of side wisdom here is that when you are about 20 weeks or 30 weeks in utero of your mother, that is the time where you develop all of your female eggs, all of your
How
eggs.
many eggs are there in total?
I have no idea.
There must be thousands.
Oh, yeah. So many. But the idea is that a woman doesn't grow eggs. She develops her eggs in utero. And so that's to say that, you as a potential life force, as an egg, was, created when your mom was in utero of your grandmother at a roughly 20 weeks or so. Isn't that crazy?
And men are producing sperms constantly.
Constantly. And so I guess that, shares the wisdom of that you're not only affected by your entire life, but also your mother's life and also that of your grandma while she was pregnant with your mum.
Yeah, like from the perspective of the Dharma traditions and karma, that potentially you are like as the potential for life, as the egg in utero, in your mother's, in your mother, in your grandmother, taking on and assimilating the karmas of your grandmother and your mother.
100%. It's crazy.
That ancestral karma. And we have had so many instances of that in our trainings with women who have memories that are not theirs, but they're actually their mother's traumatic memories.
Yeah, so it's a big process. So basically that's what the hormone does, is it starts to stimulate the follicle that is, the potential for life. And so this ripening process begins to produce estrogen, and then the rising levels of estrogen begin to signal the growth of the endometrium, which is the lining of the uterus to support life.
And so there's a growing of that uteral lining.
Yes.
It thickens and ripens and creates the fertile ground for life to propagate. And you think about the springtime, that's what happens. The earth starts to warm just enough that the seeds will start to sprout.
Exactly.
And the leaves will grow on the trees again.
Yeah. And so in Ayurveda, this time of cycle is from a kapha perspective of time. It's that idea of growing and building and nourishing and supporting all of that, which, kapha dosha is represented of.
Cool.
So yeah, a powerful time for that. So I guess when we're looking at an Ayurvedic or yogic perspective, this is time to support kapha, pacify excess kapha, meaning that, you start to move again. You come out of your cocoon of menstruation and you start to move your body. You start to get out in nature. You start to exercise in whatever way that looks like for you. You want to eat lighter, I guess, foods. Still nourishing, of course. No salads. Never recommended. Well, not never. But basically with kapha, we want to create momentum because kapha is has good stamina, but it's sometimes hard to get the ball rolling. And I think a lot of women feel that, or I definitely feel that after their menstrual cycle, that, okay, I've got to get back on the horse now. And especially me with my, 6:30 a.m. yoga practice, sometimes it takes a while for me to get the ball rolling. But when I do, then I'm supported in that process and I feel, held in that. So basically it's a time to get back into movement. It doesn't have to be anything strong right away. But yeah, you can start exercising in that kind of way, walking out in nature, starting to eat a little bit more like warming, stimulating foods like ginger and black pepper, which could be supportive.
Cool.
Yeah. So kapha supportive practices.
What about starting to plant the seeds of ideas
100%.
and planning your month and all of that.
Yeah, definitely. Yes, it's a great time to do that. And starting to sow the seeds, like we say in springtime, you sow the seeds for what you want to harvest later on. And it's, a beautiful time to build that momentum and create the right conditions for growth and for life within your life. Not only in terms of reproduction, but in terms of creativity and ideas and projects. Yeah, 100%. Cool. All right. Second cycle is ovulation phase, which is often referred to as our summer cycle, and of the full moon. So the moon is that of, illumination and brightness. And so I guess this really happens, the period of ovulation. So what happens is the ripening of eggs in the follicles, one of them is chosen for ovulation. And so the rest of them will begin to diminish and the egg that is chosen will continue to develop. And so once the egg matures, it begins to produce its own estrogen, and eventually that estrogen will trigger the luteinizing hormone from the pituitary gland. And once released, this hormone causes the egg to burst from its follicle, and that's the moment of ovulation. And that, really the egg's lifespan is only 12 to 24 hours. There's not really a lot of time for that peak of ovulation, which is, just speaks to the miracle of childbirth and the miracle of conception in itself.
A small window.
And that it is such a small window, and it's not often taught to women. And of course, there's differences in women's cycle, and, you can't say that you'll only be fertile for 12 to 24 hours. But, when I was growing up in sex ed, it was like never shared like that. It was like you could get pregnant anytime,
Yeah.
In
any way.
In any way.
You better be careful where you sit.
So it's just interesting that actually the period of ovulation is really, really a short window. And so we often say, we can categorize ovulation phase as a whole week, and that be of like a fiery and warm and energetic week. But actually the phase is, only a couple of days.
And so at this point, your uterus has got its full lining again, and it's like built up to the point where it has the capacity to hold it.
Yeah, and it will continue to grow over the next few weeks. But it's at a peak point where it could host new life for sure. Okay. And so, energetically, ovulation offers us a time where we feel more outward, we feel more social, more energetic. We can express ourselves as women a little bit better. There's more endurance and energy. It's a great time for communication, mental clarity. There's a lot of like magnetism that, you're almost drawn towards what you need to be doing, or that is drawn towards you.
Totally.
And obviously, just from like a physiological perspective, there's an amplified desire for intimacy and sex, because it's the time where a woman feels, a woman is the most fertile. And so as a physiological response for reproduction, of course, there's going to be that amplified desire.
And so this is where those stronger practices could be more beneficial.
Totally.
Where you're actually amplifying the Shakti that's already present within your body, and you can do the Kapalabhati, and you can do the Bhastrika breathing, and you can do the handstands and the headstands and all of that stuff that is so much fun and brings so much power.
Yeah, 100%. And so, it is a powerful time to do all those kind of practices. It's a powerful time to like release any projects of creative expression through work or anything like that. Schedule those important meetings during this time. It's great to be social. Schedule your social outings during this time. Yeah. It's also good to like initiate difficult conversations that need to be had, because you're the most confident, empowered version of yourself.
Yeah, and in summer it's like that. Like summer, everyone is always doing social things. We're outside, we're having fun, we're out in the world and creating. And,
yeah, 100%.
Vibrancy.
So this phase, is really like the Pitta time of cycle, that there's still that kapha and then it transitions into pitta, but it's the time of most energy and most heat and most vibrancy, and so I guess we want to support and pacify pitta where necessary. We utilize this wisdom and this power in our cycle to, like I said, schedule the important meetings, schedule the important projects, be social, go out and express yourself during this time of your cycle. Such a potent time to do so. But you want to be careful not to create any excess heat, because, if this is the time for Pitta dosha, this is the time for excess heat in the body. So we need to be more careful that we're not overdoing it. That our threshold is, of course, high with Pitta, but that we don't want to overdo it. And so we don't necessarily need too much like spicy foods or stimulants during this time. A good time to lay off the coffee, because you are stimulated, you are heightened in that way. And it can be really beautiful to create an essence of like playfulness and amusement and sweetness in life. And that kind of like pacifies the essence of Pitta, because it can be serious, it can be stern, it can be sharp, the sharpness of fire. And so allowing just that essence of creativity and playfulness to arise can be soothing.
Cool.
Cool. What comes next is the luteal phase. So technically the third phase of the menstrual cycle. And, again, you can, just categorize a week to every cycle and have it as an average. But really the ovulation happens, within a couple of days. And then for like, 2 weeks almost, is the luteal phase. Can be up to 14 days or longer. And so really this is the transition from ovulation to menstruation. And so this is the autumn, I guess, the dawning of the sun, and then comes in the retraction and the inwardness of autumn, that of the waning moon, that once the moon has become full, it starts to shed until it's new again. From an Ayurvedic perspective, it's the transition from Pitta to Vata. And so usually if we're looking at this for like a 14-day rough estimate, the first week is usually still Pitta, related to ovulation. And then the last week is more related to Vata. It's that transition of, going inward, of connection, of beginning for menstruation. And so this phase is also known as the premenstrual phase, and is often where the premenstrual symptoms are present, that it's actually before the bleed happens, people experience the most of their symptoms. Okay. And so anatomical, the follicle that was responsible for holding the egg transforms itself into what we call the corpus luteum, and it's that is now responsible for hormones. So it creates progesterone as well as small amounts of estrogen within the uterus. And so at this phase, that it's like responsible for nourishing and supporting a pregnancy if conception was to occur. And so at this point, whether the body doesn't yet know if conception has taken place. Even if there's no sex, even if there's no sperm, the body still expects that this potential for life as an egg could be a pregnancy and thus must support it. And so body temperatures kind of rise to, keep heat, a safe, nurturing environment for life. And also the progesterone stops the endometrium from thickening and begins to get it ready for the potential attachment of a fertilized egg, so that to attach to the endometrium lining. Yeah. And so it
gets a little stickier.
Yeah, probably. And so this phase is then determined by the lifespan of the corpus luteum, which is, this physiological response to that of supporting pregnancy. Like I said, usually lasts about 14 days from the moment of ovulation to the day of the first bleed on average. So this phase offers us, time to start evaluating, start editing and reflecting on, our cycle so far, projects that we're working on. We've become a little bit more sensitive to the subtleties. And that's what essence, like PMS, premenstrual syndrome or symptoms really are, is that you're just becoming a little more sensitive to what's going on.
Totally.
And that's something that I've learned in one of my courses, is that PMS is not saying for 1 week out of your whole cycle that you're out of balance. It's saying that you're out of balance in all moments, but it's at this time where you're the most sensitive to it. And so there's also this essence of like heightened creativity during this phase as well. And so physiological, halfway through this phase of luteal, progesterone peaks, and then once it begins to drop, and then that's kind of like the downfall into the stage of Vata. It's when we begin to retreat inwards, we start to conserve our energy, we start to feel like we have less space for others, that we, have to create that space for ourselves, and we kind of, draw away from social interaction, draw away from work, and we feel like a little more sensitive. And it's in this time that we're feeling where we are being supported by nature to help us evolve and grow with the process of shedding, letting go of what no longer serves.
So what are you shedding?
Well, not yet. But this time is beautiful to start to listen and
listen to what needs to be shed.
Yeah, and the symptoms that arise. Like, it's just a time to really evaluate your cycle and what's going on for you, and embrace all aspects of yourself. It's kind of like the last test before the finish line. Like, if we're living in alignment with our cycle, it's like, how can we navigate these times that are challenging but still have that strength and that faith and that, nurturance for our bodies during this time. And so this is a time, from that transition from Pitta to Vata. So it depends on the phase with what practices you want to do. Anything close to ovulation, you can still do those high energy practices. Anything as you start to trail towards the menstrual cycle, you want to support Vata a little more. So maybe some more slower, gentler, more grounded practice. Warmer, heavier foods start to get craved and introduced. And so, there's so many ways that we can support that in yoga practice. You can support it with like a lunar style yoga. You can start to do yin, basically anything that supports, slow steadiness,
Slowing you
inwardness, groundedness is helpful, and starting to create the little pockets for rest within your experience. Cool. So then what comes next is menstruation, the last phase of the cycle, representative of our winter phase, that of inwardness, that of coolness, that of conserved energy. Also represents the new moon phase, so the phase where the moon is the, smallest.
Darkness.
The darkest, yeah, that's the right word. And it's representative of Vata dosha. And so what happens is, if there's been no conception, meaning, that there's no egg and sperm meet to produce life, then the corpus luteum eventually shrinks and dies. And because it's no longer producing progesterone, there's nothing to sustain the lining of the uterus. And so this hormonal drop prepares the uterine lining to start to shed. And so that is the process of menstruation. And often what we experience as cramps is the womb space literally contracting and expanding to shed that lining of endometrium lining. Powerful. And it's really, representative of death. And I was sharing this in my workshop, that it's just so beautiful and interesting that as women, we get to interface with the experience of death every month.
Yeah, every single month. It was like a moment for me that the lining of the uterus is replenished every single month, and it's shed every single month. That there is... Yeah, there's a death that happens.
Yeah, it's this physical reminder of blood. Something we very often associate with death is that no life has taken place. Like there was the opportunity for life and no life has taken place.
And there almost needs to be a grieving process.
Oh, 100%. And that is the stage of menstrual cycle. That is the menstrual phase. That there is this grieving of who you were in that last month, and that now that is no longer, and that you evolve.
And it's also the Trimurti. It's like those phases of life that are so prevalent in the yoga tradition, of the birth-giving quality, the nourishing quality of life, and then the destructive quality of death. That you have that experience viscerally month to month.
And what a beautiful experience of that, that you get to interface and become more familiar and intimate with the experience of death in every month. Something very overwhelming and maybe a little scary for a lot of people to consider. But it is powerful when you start to listen to it.
Yeah.
And so this stage of the cycle allows us, a deeper connection to intuition and inner wisdom. It allows us, space for a more supportive rest, connection to self, the power of release, and also we're very much attuned to the subtleties of everything. And so it's a powerful time to practice and to meditate and to be in that creative vata, air-like etheric space.
And potentially like home practice.
Potentially
definitely. Practice that's like alone and inwards, and you can really lean into sadhana at this time.
Totally. And if you do want to practice externally to your house, yin, such a beautiful practice for this period of time. Meditation, exactly. And so, we need a rest during this time. We feel less social and outward, and we want to conserve our energy. And of course, doing less when we're menstruating is challenging because it rebels against everything that the capitalist society has told us to be. But we must remind ourselves that we're not machines.
What's
women.
Been your experience of that, just like as a woman, and having the space each month that every time you're menstruating, I just kind of pick up your slack.
Yeah.
Of I'll cover your classes, I'll let you sleep in, I'll give you the space to do whatever you need to do. What's that experience?
Oh, so nourishing. Yeah. And just very much a rewiring for me that, it's just a letting go and not having to do anything or do what I need to or want to on those times. And that, I remember going to school, and whenever I was, menstruating, I would go to the school nurse and she would just give you painkillers. And then I would go to sport class. Yeah. And then the sport teacher would say, no, it doesn't matter. Just get on with it. Yeah. And, it's been very much a rewiring of, the idea is that it's most efficient for us to rest during this time. So why wouldn't we do that?
So do you find that, because I know sometimes you don't heed the advice of rest and you'll just power through and you'll be on your laptop for that whole week, or we'll be running a training and you've got to come in and teach a class or do whatever. Do you find that there's a difference between giving yourself the space to rest for that week and then, what's the difference?
Well, I think that, not even speaking to my experience, but like the common thing that comes out of that is like what we see as burnout in the modern day superwoman, is that if there's no like little pockets of rest where it's most efficient for you to rest during this phase of cycle, that you'll just go and go and go until you hit burnout and then you're forced to rest.
Yeah. Okay.
And so where really this offers us the opportunity to rest as we go, and that if it's most efficient to take 1 or 2 days to completely rest here, like
rest and
it allows you to be more efficient during your other phases of cycle.
Totally. Oh, your ovulation phase is like our business is thriving. We're getting all the shit done.
Yeah.
It's like all the emails are answered, all of the inspirations there. And so you're 100% right that if that rest time is taken, then the productivity in the productive time is amplified.
100%.
Otherwise, that kind of like burnout symptom, it will continue through to the ovulation phase.
Yes, exactly. It will just be picked up somewhere else. And so, I guess it's just an interesting experience that you have to create the rest for yourself. And the thing is that if you're in a job or a profession where you don't have that space, or motherhood is a good example of that, is that even if you don't have the space to nourish yourself in that way, that maybe how you show up as like a vulnerable and creative and, gentle woman in that phase is, a powerful lesson to those in your presence. And we were talking about it. One of the girls that came to my workshop is a school teacher, and she teaches at an all boys school. And she was talking about how, like, is it appropriate to, offer that? And, I said, well, you'd have to work that out for yourself. But another girl who is the mother of 2 young boys talked about her experience of educating her boys about it. And that, this is a time where I do this and I do this and I feel like this. And that, there's vulnerability in that. And that, we can take that position that, when you're menstruating, you just let people know. And people are just so, like, especially men, are just like uncomfortable. Shocked that you would say something like that to them. But it's always so fun. I find whenever I share that with somebody, if it's a woman or a man, it allows them the opportunity to share their experience or talk freely about it. If it's a man, talking about how his girlfriend or his mother experiences it. Or if it's a woman, talking about how she experiences it. And the power is in sharing and offering that space to have conversation about it.
Totally. And I think, like, even as a yoga teacher, it's so handy.
It's so good to know.
It's so handy to know.
I know.
Just like, because you can give the options, then you can plan the class accordingly. Yeah. Especially if, like, in most settings, yoga classes are majority women. Yeah. It's very rare that I would get a full class of men. And if I did, I would teach a very different class. And so I guess on that topic, maybe our last topic before we wrap up, of the cycle and the moon, and that it's very traditionally in the way that I've shared the cycle is that, the menstrual phase aligns with the new moon. And so to be in alignment with the moon is to bleed with the new moon and to ovulate with the full moon. There's many different, like, modern day woman experience of this is like, if you bleed with the full moon, it means this. If you bleed with the waning moon, it means this. But in essence, if you really want to tap into that energetic realm, it's best to be menstruating with the new moon. And that's not to say if you menstruate with the full moon, it's not appropriate. Or it's wrong.
It's just, it's different. And there's different practices that we can do to align ourselves in cycle with the new moon. But for me personally, like, up until a couple months ago, I was bleeding with the full moon for, quite a period of time. And it was just exhausting. I was just, I had the energy of ovulation at the time of new moon where I already felt inward and introspective. And it was just a confusing time. And so as a yoga teacher or as somebody practicing yoga, if majority of the women are like somewhat synced up to the new moon, you just are wary around that time, and you're wary of the practices that you offer at that time. But as a teacher for both a man and a woman here, like, it's so powerful to know when our students are menstruating, and that it's not something taboo or anything like that. If somebody lets us know, it's like, oh my God, thank you so much for letting me know that. That's amazing.
Yeah, and I think just like as a general rule, you can just give those options of like, if you are menstruating and I'm offering bridge pose, you can do a belly down back bend. You can do Sphinx pose, or you could do even bow pose if you wanted something intense, but it was just flipped upside down.
Yeah, and I think that I often teach a very menstrual friendly kind of class, that it's very easy to offer something like that. But yeah, it's beautiful if you teach to give the options, but sometimes it can be helpful, especially as a man, to provide the context as well. Just in those moments, in the shortest sentence possible, because, for a woman to be like told that she can't do something because she's menstruating, it kind of elicits that sensation of shame that we were talking about at the beginning.
Totally.
Cool. Well, I think that's all I have to share right now. I have a lot more content. I'll be running another Ayurvedic menstruation workshop, so if you're somewhere local, just stay updated for that. And I might eventually film it and put it on the online studio one day. Otherwise, if you're interested in getting to know more about how you can live in alignment with your cycle in this way, I'm open for consultations. We can do Ayurvedic nutrition, lifestyle, all this kind of stuff, start to talk about specific symptoms and why they're being caused. There's so much to it that I could not only share in an hour podcast, but I hope that you've gotten something out of this and that it inspires you to go into it a little bit more.
Yeah, and just start to unpack it for yourself and how it relates to you and your family and your friends and your partners and whatever it is. This is something that's happening for all women at all times, and to understand it is to understand the essence of the feminine. And I think that the more that we can honor that as a society, the more that we can honor that with our friends and our family, the better off the world will be. So thank you for joining me for this conversation.
You're welcome.
Paige.
Thanks for sharing it with me.
If you are interested in learning from us, we have trainings happening all the time. This year specifically, we're going to India, and most of our big trainings will be happening in India. Our next 200-hour intake will be in Rishikesh in India. We have a beautiful retreat center. It's happening in September. Am I correct in saying that?
For 3 weeks.
And there's plenty of spaces left. So if you're interested in becoming a yoga teacher with us in India this year, head over to our website. There will be a link in the show notes.
Yeah, and we're also running a 7-day or 8-day, yoga and Ayurveda retreat over there as well. So if yoga teacher training is not your thing, or if you've already done one, you can definitely still join us for a trip to India. We'd love to have you, and all the details will be on the show notes for that as well.
And we would love for you to come and visit us in the studio. If you live in Melbourne or Victoria, come and visit us. Our studio is in Berwick. It's a beautiful space. We have a beautiful community, and we would love to join you for practice. And if not, then perhaps you could check out our online studio on our website. We have over 200 classes on there, and we're uploading stuff all the time. We're starting to transition to a little bit of a different format. We're starting to include some courses. We're currently uploading a 8-week Learn to Meditate course on there. So there's lots going on, and there's lots of opportunities to practice with us. So if you took something out of this information, I would almost guarantee that you will take so much out of our courses, because these conversations are just tiny little snippets of the magnitude and multitude of information that we share in our training courses. And as you probably know by now, Paige and I are nothing short of yoga and Ayurveda nerds, Vedic nerds, as we call ourselves. And we're so in love with the knowledge and how can it be applied to allow us to live our most authentic and vibrant and empowered lives and shape society as a whole.
Yeah, and on that, we do have an online 100-hour Hatha training as well. For people that are yoga teachers, you can do 100 hours continuing education with Yoga Alliance, or if you're just interested in learning more, it's all pre-recorded, all ready to go. So you can head to our website and sign up right now if you feel called to learn more.
And finally, we're working on some new stuff at the moment. We're putting out some new trainings very soon. So keep your eyes peeled, because we've got so much to offer and so much to share. And if you enjoyed this episode, please just share it. That's all we ask. We put so much effort into running the podcast and sharing in this way. It's very valuable for us. We enjoy having these conversations. But if you enjoy them, please just share them with someone. We're trying to get the podcast to grow a little bit, and to share the message. So please just share it. Share it on your Instagram story. Share it with the women in your life and the men in your life that are open to listening to this conversation. I think it's a valuable conversation for everyone to take part in.
Definitely.
Okay then. Hariom.
Hariom.
Much love.